Hello there. In this life, there are moments when we are forced to confront despair so profound that it defies description. Everyone has their own answer to the question, what is the most hopeless situation? But for the woman in today's story, the greatest despair was perhaps realizing that all her efforts to cling to life would ultimately be in vain. Death was inevitable, no matter how hard she fought against it. On April 1st, 2012, in the city of Suwon, South Korea, at around 10:30 p.m., 28-year-old Kim was walking home after a long day at work. She was employed at a mobile phone manufacturing company, which was only about a kilometer away from her home. By this time, the buses had stopped running, and taking a taxi would cost her around 2,000 won. In reality, this amount was not particularly high, and her company even provided a transportation allowance of 100,000 won, but Kim didn't want to waste even a single one. Her family was struggling financially. She had to help pay off her father's debts while also taking care of her mother and younger brother, who was still in university. Although her salary was not too low, she lived frugally, saving every possible penny to support her family. For this reason, she chose to walk home rather than spend money on a taxi. However, nearly 5 hours later, Kim had still not arrived home, and her family was unable to reach her. Overcome with worry, they decided to report her missing to the police. But it wasn't until 3 a.m. on April 2nd that the police began their search. Initially, only 2 patrol cars and 5 officers were dispatched to the scene. Kim's older sister also joined the search efforts. But when the police car stopped in front of a convenience store, instead of taking action, the 2 officers inside dozed off, leaving Kim's sister to listen to updates through their radio. Little did they know that just 10 meters away, the Yas monster was still there, and the victim was still alive. At 6:00 a.m., the number of officers increased to 10. By 6:50 a.m., 35 members of the investigative team officially took over. However, the chief of criminal investigations, who should have been present from the beginning, only arrived at 9 a.m., acting as if this case was of little importance. At 9:30 a.m., the police knocked on the door of a gas station located just 5 meters from the rented home of Oh Won-chung. The station owner provided a crucial piece of information. The previous night, between 10:30 and 11 p.m., he had been drinking outside when he suddenly heard a woman's desperate scream. Thinking it might be a fight, he got up to check, but all he saw was a dark alley. Then a loud metallic slam echoed through the night, followed by a woman sobbing and pleading, "I was wrong! Please, help me!" He hesitated for a few seconds before going back inside, assuming it was just a domestic dispute. Based on this information, the officers approached a rusted metal door tucked between rows of dilapidated houses. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned storage unit. They knocked, but there was no response. When they stepped inside, they were met with a scene so horrifying that it would haunt them for the rest of their careers. In the damp, mold-streaked room, a middle-aged man sat casually smoking a cigarette, his eyes fixed on an adult film playing on his screen. In his hand was a blood-stained knife, the crimson still fresh. In front of him, Kim's body had been dismembered and stuffed into at least 14 plastic bags. Some of the bags had even been crammed into the washing machine. The sheer brutality of the crime surpassed anything the police had ever witnessed. Kim's body had been butchered into hundreds of pieces, requiring 14 forensic doctors, far more than the usual 2 or 3 assigned to a homicide case, to piece together her remains. Due to the extreme level of mutilation, it was impossible to determine whether she had been sexually assaulted. The man at the crime scene was immediately taken into custody. His name was Oh Won-chung, a Chinese national born as Wu Xunyuan in 1982 in Inner Mongolia. Soon after, he confessed everything that had transpired the previous night. Around 9 p.m. on April 1st, 2012, Oh Won-chung returned to his rented apartment after work. The remnants of a previous meal, a few pieces of pig's trotters, still sat on the table, enough for dinner. He poured himself a glass of strong liquor, then another and another. As the alcohol seeped into his system, he silently peeled a tangerine, his gaze fixed on the television screen. After a while, he stood up, intending to step outside for a smoke and to take out the trash. But whether it was the alcohol giving him courage or a sudden burst of impulse, a primal desire overtook him. He decided to hide behind an electrical pole outside his home, waiting for a woman to pass by. 20 minutes later, Kim appeared. At that moment, Oh Won-chung lunged from behind the pole. Before Kim could react, he grabbed her by the neck, choking her tightly as he dragged her into his apartment. Overwhelmed with terror, Kim froze, her mind gripped by panic. She was too shocked to resist immediately. Oh Won-chung's apartment was damp, filthy, and reeked of decay. There was hardly any furniture, just a chaotic mess of trash and random objects. Strangely, despite the abundance of sanitary pads scattered across the floor, there was no sign of any female presence. In the corner of the room, an open suitcase revealed his clothing and underwear. Some garments were strewn carelessly across the bed, making the space feel even more suffocating. He turned to Kim and said nonchalantly, "I'll pay you. More than 10 times what I pay for rent." Kim didn't respond. She knew reasoning with this man was pointless. Her only chance was to escape. She scanned the room, searching for a way out. The door was right behind Oh Won-chung, but he was blocking the exit. She cautiously stepped forward, pretending to move past him in hopes of finding an opportunity to dash outside. But Oh Won-chung saw through her plan. He grabbed her, threw her to the floor, and dragged her into the bedroom. Pinning her down on the bed, he began tearing at her clothes. But Kim refused to submit. She fought back with all her strength, thrashing wildly and making it impossible for him to carry out his intentions immediately. Then, Oh Won-chung suddenly felt the urge to urinate. In reality, he always felt this sensation before engaging in any sexual act. So, he let go of Kim and stood up, walking toward the bathroom, which was only a few steps from the bedroom. The bathroom was located along the path leading to the front door. If Kim wanted to escape, this was her only chance. However, Oh Won-chung, while relieving himself, kept his eyes on the bedroom, glancing over periodically to monitor her movements. Afraid that she would be caught again, Kim changed her plan. She sprinted toward the bedroom door and locked it from the inside. Then she grabbed her phone and dialed 112 to call the police. As soon as the call connected, she repeatedly stated that she was being attacked and tried to describe her location. However, the emergency operator did not immediately alert the police. Instead, they bombarded her with questions, asking if she was certain she was being assaulted, who the attacker was, how he had entered the room, and demanding more precise details before taking action. Outside the room, Oh Won-chung pounded on the door. Kim, consumed by terror, pleaded for her life. But the door could not protect her for long. He burst in, snatched the phone from her hands, and flung it into a corner. The emergency call only managed to capture the operator's final words. "Hello, please repeat that." After that, the line remained open, but all the police could hear were Kim's desperate screams, interwoven with the sickening sound of fabric being torn apart. Inside the filthy lair of the monster, Kim trembled in fear. Throughout the night, unable to sleep, Oh Won-chung, frustrated by her fierce resistance, failed to rape her and eventually fell asleep holding her. But as the first light of dawn crept in, the beast awoke, his hunger still unsatisfied. He lunged at her again, but Kim continued to fight back with all her strength. Oh Won-chung's rage boiled over. He had kidnapped this woman, held her captive all night, and yet she still defied him. Overcome with fury, he stormed out of the room, heading straight to the kitchen, where he rummaged under the sink and grabbed a wrench. Without hesitation, he returned to the room, lifted the tool high above his head, and brought it crashing down onto Kim's skull. Blood seeped from the blanket, spreading across the mattress. He wrapped her lifeless body, dragged her into the bathroom, and lit a cigarette, contemplating his next move. But just then, Kim's body began convulsing, trembling violently. Oh Won-chung rushed back into the bedroom, grabbed a scarf, and strangled her until he was certain she was dead. Where were the police during all this time? Hours had passed since the family reported Kim missing, yet the police had only begun a lackluster search. Within a 300-meter radius of the crime scene, there were 137 households. Incredibly, 133 of them later claimed they had no idea the police were even there. This was because the officers only checked houses with lights on, quietly passing by those that were dark, never knocking, never verifying. Even worse, rather than taking decisive action, officers merely pressed their ears against doors to listen for suspicious noises. If they heard nothing, they simply walked away. When questioned later, South Korean police defended their approach, saying that since it was nighttime, they didn't want to disturb the residents. They considered checking every house too troublesome, despite having the legal authority to enter private property if a life was in danger. And so, for the entire 6 hours of Kim's captivity, no one arrived in time to save her. It wasn't until 9:30 a.m. the next day, when police knocked on the door of a gas station near the suspect's home and received a witness statement, that the truth began to unfold. On April 4th, the police held a press conference admitting their failure. Despite deploying 35 officers for an overnight search and arresting the suspect within 13 hours, they had been unable to save Kim. The real issue was that the police had received an emergency call from the victim, a fragile chance that could have changed everything. According to them, the call lasted only 15 seconds and provided no useful information, no description of the suspect, no address, no name, just a weak plea. "I'm being attacked." But if that was the case, why hadn't they released the full recording? Public suspicion grew. In response to mounting criticism, South Korean authorities revised their statement on April 5th, revealing that the call had actually lasted 1 minute and 20 seconds. When the recording was finally released, the public was horrified.
네, 여기 목걸놀이터 전에 집인데요. 저 지금 성폭행 당하고 있거든요.
Even in her desperate situation, Kim had tried to remain calm, repeatedly stating her location clearly.
목걸놀이터요?
네, 목걸놀이터 전에 집인데 어느 집인지 모르겠어요.
Yet the emergency operator bombarded her with meaningless robotic questions.
네, 경찰대학교 좀 지나서 목걸놀이터 가는 길쯤으로요.
Questions no one could possibly answer while facing imminent death. Even more disturbingly, this operator had only been on the job for 2 months, with less than 2 weeks of training.
들어갈 때 다시 한 번만 알려줄래요?
잘못했어요. 아저씨 잘못했어요.
여보세요?
As the sound of the door being kicked in echoed through the call, Kim's nightmare truly began. Yet even in that moment of terror, she cleverly pretended to disconnect and threw the phone aside, hoping the police would trace her location through the signal. In reality, the call had lasted not 1 minute and 20 seconds, but 7 minutes and 36 seconds, 5 times longer than the police initially claimed. Instead of acknowledging their failure, the authorities defended their actions, claiming that the last 6 minutes of the call contained nothing but screams and pleas for mercy, which held little investigative value. They insisted they withheld the full recording to protect the victim's family. But Kim's family did not believe this excuse. They demanded to hear the entire recording, and what they discovered was not just heartbreaking, it was infuriating. Those who listened to all 7 minutes and 36 seconds of the call were not just devastated but outraged. South Korea's 112 emergency system classified calls on a scale from 0 to 4 before forwarding them to the nearest police station. The station that received Kim's call was only a 7-minute drive from the scene, but instead of acting swiftly, the emergency operator hesitated, unsure how to handle the situation. As a result, the call was passed around between 20 officers, leading to a ridiculous discussion while the victim suffered.
여보세요? 주소 다시 한 번만 알려주세요.
The last 6 minutes of the call were not just filled with Kim's cries for help. They also captured the officers' casual conversation. They spoke carelessly, lazily, and even failed to mute their own voices. During Kim's most desperate moments, one officer remarked, "I think they know each other. Could this be a domestic dispute?" Another officer lazily replied, "No one's answering, just hang up." And just like that, Kim's final plea for help, her only chance at survival, was cruelly cut off by the very people sworn to protect her. Beyond the lies about the emergency call, On April 2nd, during their search, police had already confirmed that a security camera at the back entrance of an elementary school had captured footage of Oh Won-chung dragging his victim. The 13-second clip was undeniable evidence. Yet, until April 9, more than a week later, the police continued to deny the existence of this footage. When confronted, officers explained that since the suspect had already been arrested early on, they had not prioritized reviewing the video. Kim's case was a glaring testament to the catastrophic failure of South Korea's emergency response system. From the emergency dispatcher to the police officers, every link in the rescue chain failed, robbing her of multiple chances to survive. First, the incompetence of the 112 operator significantly delayed response time. If the dispatcher had been better trained, they could have guided Kim to provide more useful details, such as the floor number of the building, the suspect's appearance, or whether he had facial hair. Detailed information like this would have helped pinpoint her location and apprehend the criminal. Moreover, in emergency situations, police generally advise victims to keep their phone lines open until officers arrive. Kim, despite not being instructed to do so, had the intelligence to leave the call connected. This could have provided crucial background noise for investigators to analyze. However, in this case, the police recklessly cut off the call. An irresponsible operator, inexperienced witnesses, and passive search efforts all worked together to push Kim further and further toward an irreversible fate. Furthermore, law enforcement made baffling decisions that unnecessarily expanded the search area. Upon reviewing the case, experts pointed out that if the police had initially focused on the 65 households Kim had described, a small search team could have quickly located the suspect. However, this report was disregarded by a newly appointed police chief. Instead, he maintained vague orders, causing the investigation area to expand to a staggering 3,000 households. Following the case, the killer's motives became a topic of heated debate. When Oh Won-chung arrived in South Korea in 2007, he worked as a farmer and took on various temporary jobs. He had traveled to South Korea for work 3 times and had a wife and children back in China. In May 2010, he began working in the Suwon, Seodong area. The room he rented was 19.8 square meters, with a monthly rent of 150,000 Korean won, equivalent to about 800 Chinese yuan. He drank alcohol daily and hired special services every month. After borrowing from high-interest lenders, he found himself unable to repay his debts and was frequently beaten, which fueled his obsession with money. Oh Won-chung killed Kim because he was enraged by her resistance during his attempted assault. He also feared losing the 7 million won, approximately 40,000 Chinese yuan, he had earned from his work in South Korea. At that moment, the monster recalled scenes from American mafia films, and to avoid being caught by the police, he sought to destroy the victim's body as thoroughly as possible. However, Kim's family and the public raised doubts about this reasoning. According to Oh Won-chung, his primary goal was to dispose of the body and flee as quickly as possible. Yet his execution of the crime appeared disturbingly methodical and cold-blooded. He spent 6 hours meticulously dismembering the victim into over 200 pieces, yet he left her internal organs intact. This detail led the court to consider an alternative motive, potentially related to organ trafficking. However, during the appeal trial, the Suwon court dismissed this theory, concluding that Oh had simply acted with extreme brutality in a state of desperation. His bank account showed no suspicious transactions, and the victim's remains had been placed only in plastic bags. Ultimately, Oh Won-chung was spared the death penalty from the initial ruling and instead sentenced to life in prison. Additionally, he was ordered to wear an electronic monitoring device for 30 years and have his personal information publicly disclosed for 10 years. Nevertheless, critics argued that sparing Oh Won-chung, a man who attempted to assault a woman and then dismembered her, was unjust. In a post-case interview, the head of Suwon's criminal investigation team stated that finding the victim within 13 hours was remarkably fast, and that even if they had located her sooner, she might have already been dead. This cold and detached remark further infuriated the South Korean public. As a result, the officer was suspended from duty for 3 months. Under immense public pressure, the National Police Commissioner also submitted his resignation.